Yes, I did for my sins. My first degree was in mathematics, and looking back, it was a complete waste of time. Except it taught me one thing: if in doubt, go back to first principles. And this evening I want to start with first principles to develop the argument I want to put to you. There are three levels of truth. There's a basic level of truth. Someone rings you up and says at 9:30 this morning, I had a cup of coffee. Probably true, but who cares? Sort of material truth, fact. It's the sort of truth that science studies, and in the West, science has been brilliant at doing that in the most sophisticated way, which has transformed the way we live. But it's not essentially different than that, the fact level of truth. Second level of truth is the ethical or moral level of truth. The thou shalt nots of the culture, Ten Commandments, the important thou shalt nots in any human society. The ethical level of truth, very important for community, for us behaving well towards each other, checking extremes, is universal. You'll find the same. This is me, the sociologist. You'll find the same essential thou shalt nots in every human culture. There are variations at the margins, but the ethical order of truth is universal. The third level of truth, which you might call capital T truth or metaphysical truth, is the very difficult one, and which is the level of truth which is at the core of every culture. It varies from culture to culture. And it's about, for all humans, there are three key questions. Where do I come from? The Genesis question. What should I do with my life in order to make sense of it? The why am I here question. These are metaphysical questions. What should I do with my life in order to make sense of it, if that's possible? And that's, of course, been this sort of largely post-church modernity that's become very problematic for a lot of people. And the third big metaphysical truth, the death question: what happens when I die? Is it just like a fish on the beach rotting and stinking into oblivion, or is there more? Is death not merely death, to quote Luther? The three metaphysical questions. Now, this is my first principle still, if you'll forgive me for this mathematical approach. In every human culture, we answer the big capital T truth question, the big why am I here questions, what happens when I die, through stories. We tell stories. Our own Indigenous populations, Australian Aborigines, have the word the dreaming for the important stories. Now, every culture has dreaming stories. They're basically archetypal stories from a long time ago, created sort of in the beginning. And they frame the way. We never escape our archetypal dreaming stories. The Aboriginal theory of culture is a great theory. It's absolutely right. Their stories are very different from our Western dreaming stories or archetypal stories. The Western archetype, and they're Westerners, there's all sorts of questioning and doubting about that, but in terms of serious cultural foundations, we have grown up in the West, and that's our cultural background. The Western dreaming comes from two basic sources: the ancient Greeks, classical Greece, Homer, Greek tragedy, Greek mythology, a range of the image of the hero, which has reverberated through the West since Homer has its origins in Homer's Iliad. And of course, the other major source of Western dreaming is the Jesus stories. The two are not as separate as often thought, in that we know Jesus through four stories, basically, the four Gospels. There's virtually nothing else known about him. He's the creation of four stories. They're all written in Greek. They're Greek stories. They're not Aramaic stories. They're not Hebrew stories. They're Greek stories. The writers, the creators of those stories, wrote in Greek. All right, this is our Western dreaming. This is the lens through which we understand ourselves, the world we inhabit, why we're here, and if our life makes sense, if it can possibly make sense. Now, what we do, what every culture does, and I'm still with first principles here, with the dreaming stories, it does what the ancient Jews call midrash. Every generation has to retell those formative stories in a way that speak to the times. You've sort of got to bring them up to date, or they die. Or someone else will do it for you and probably do it in ways that sort of distorts them in ways you may not like. Midrash, very, very important. Every generation, the central task of any cultural elite, and it doesn't matter whether it's religious, educational, making films, the masters of the Renaissance, the central task of all cultural elites, most of our cultural elites have given up on this, and that's why we're in such difficulty in terms of the capital T truths. The central task of the cultural elites is to midrash the dreaming stories. Well, that brings me to the Jesus story. Back to Oscar Wilde called them 4 prose poems about Jesus, and as you in this room know probably all too well, there's sort of 4 different Jesuses in the four different narratives. I think there are 2 fundamentally different Jesuses. Maybe just, I've got limited time tonight, so let me simplify to some degree. There's the Good Samaritan Jesus, the ethical Jesus, the love thy neighbour as thyself Jesus, who's largely the creation of Matthew and Luke. He's predominated in the history of Christianity, the Matthew-Luke Jesus of the children's little Lord Jesus lays down his sweet head. Love thy neighbour as thyself, Good Samaritan, and so forth. The other Jesus, and I've written a book called The Existential Jesus, comes out principally from Mark and to a lesser degree from John, who I suggest is the only one of the other writers who understood Mark. It's generally agreed now that Mark was the first written of almost all biblical scholars would agree that Mark was the first written of the four Gospels. It's the most difficult to read and to understand. In straight literary terms, it's the most virtuoso, it's the most brilliant virtuoso piece of storytelling, probably I'll make an assertion in the Bible, apart from segments in John. Two of the greatest modern secular literary critics, Frank Kermode in England and Harold Bloom in the United States, have singled out Mark as not only the creator of Jesus, but as Harold Bloom says, it's a text that's just so virtuoso we still don't really understand it. Now let me talk a little bit about this, because one of my themes here in terms of trying to get Jesus to speak again. I mean, we live basically now in a culture and a civilization where Jesus is forgotten. You know, most people are not told Jesus' story. It's becoming defunct. The only part of the Jesus narrative that's familiar is the Nativity at Christmas. And I think that's only well known because of children. Because there's a deep sort of drive for a saviour today, and for most families, the surrogate or the potential saviours of their children. You took the children away, the sort of the twinkle, twinkle, little star sort of redemptive cast that's put on children. I think it's wonderful that that happens. If you took that away, I suspect the Nativity would die too, you know, in spite of the beauty of Christmas carols. So we're living in a time when, you know, if we're talking about the fundamentals of our culture, there's the dreaming. A major component of it is becoming derelict. It's reappearing, we can talk about this later on, it's reappearing in popular culture and all sorts of displacements. But in terms of the story itself, it's less and less well known. And again, as you're familiar with, in a couple of instances of my sociological self, In our country, something like 5 or 6% of the population go to church regularly. So it's a very small minority of people who are regular churchgoers. This has become extremely marginal. Now, I think this is very serious. I think you give up. And you know, Christianity has got in its stories of the life of Jesus, has got the most rich treasure trove of archetypes in our culture. And yet, the Midrash is failing. The retelling that story so that it will speak today is left to an occasional filmmaker. And it's displaced into figures who are saviours, but they're not explicitly Jesus figures at all, and usually they turn into antichrists. We can talk about that. And I think one of the main reasons for this is that the Christian churches have largely given up on telling the story and have reverted back to the second order of truth, the ethical or the moral order, into justice. And as noble and as important as all of this is, it's not it's not at the centre of what takes people to what takes people to religion. And also, our society doesn't really need the churches anymore as ethical teachers. Popular culture does it. I mean, watch detective series and the most popular things on television, murder mysteries, the front pages of the tabloid press. They're all about, you know, people behaving badly and people behaving well, about heroes and villains and horror. And we live in any realistic historical terms, we live in one of the most orderly, non-violent, peaceful societies that's ever existed. Morality is not the problem today, meaning is the problem. It's not the middle order of truth, the moral or ethical order of truth that's wrong. And the church is in focusing on that more and more and becoming politically active in the moral sphere about refugees or whatever it happens to be, I think are taking their eyes off what would get people interested again in Christianity, which is the Jesus story. The capital T truth is going on in the Jesus story. Now, I think it's the Mark John Jesus, not the... I mean, times changed. The Luke, Matthew, love thy neighbour as thyself, Good Samaritan Jesus was very important for a lot of Western history. It was crucial through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Vital. It's no longer that important. We do morality pretty well these days, whatever you see in the newspapers. We don't do meaning well at all. We've lost touch with that. Now let me then switch to Mark. Mark's Jesus, in my interpretation, is the great philosopher of being. We live in a society which is very much caught up with questions of self and identity, of who am I, what's the fundamental, what's the central truth about me as a human individual, which will allow me to find sense in my life. Now, my suggestion is that Mark's Gospel is the great text in the West about the nature of being. And let me elaborate a little bit here to try and give you some idea of how the reading of Mark goes. Mark is very cryptic. He's an anti-doctrine, an anti-dogma storyteller. Dogma and doctrine, our human reflex when we're nervous or anxious or worried about something is we'll try and come to a conclusion, well, it's A or it's B or it's C. I want to understand what's happening to me or who you are. It's A, B, C. Mark constantly undercuts any of our impulses to say, that's the particular truth. Mark's first word in Greek is arche. He starts typically very cryptically. The word Genesis or beginning or origin. Now this is a tactical move. He's basically saying, I'm going to tell you about where the important things start, what the arche is in archaeology is. It's not in Genesis in the Old Testament. You know the Genesis story, the Jewish story. That's That's completely beside the point. I'm going to tell you the story that matters. In the beginning, and John adapts this to his famous line, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos. Logos could equally well be translated as story, by the way. You can read John's opening lines, in the beginning was a story. My suggestion is this is really what Mark and John both mean. In the beginning was the story. It's the story that we're going to tell you that's about to follow. So this is very radical. It's basically ditching the culture that comes before. It's understandable that Matthew then goes back to being much more pro-Jewish. It's very, very different past in Matthew. But Mark is basically saying, the capital T truth, mythos, starts with me, or starts with the story I'm about to tell you. And he works through a series of what Frank Kermode calls impression points. This story works by, as a film, we know this in films, there are climactic points, there are scenes which are particularly vivid, which strike your imagination. And Mark has a series of very vivid scenes, and if you want to read the text, you get into those particular scenes and try and unpack what's going on. Let me take one of them, and it's one of my favourite ones. It's the walking on water scene. I particularly like the walking on water scene because it's completely shock horror to all modern interpreters say, well, of course humans don't walk on water. This just shows you what primitive, fairy tale, sort of unbelievable story this is. And in fact, lots of interpreters, Christian interpreters even of the New Testament, have tried to get somehow sort of deny the miracle stories like walking on water. The prelude to is, probably all familiar with this, Jesus has spent a day teaching 5,000 people. And when he's actually, at this point of the story, it's about a third of the way through, he's withdrawn, and he's pretty fed up by this stage. He doesn't know what he's doing. Mark's Jesus is the strange, we know this in the American Western, he's the stranger who comes in from nowhere, suddenly there. In Mark, there's no birth story, there's no manger, there's no shepherds by night, there's none of that. He suddenly appears. We're not even told his age. We know from the other stories he's in his young 30s. He's just suddenly there, the mysterious stranger. And throughout the story, he's extraordinarily alone. I mean, I would suggest there's no narrative in the West, there's no major narrative in which the hero is so solitary as this Jesus. He chooses his followers. He realises very, very quickly by chapter 4 that they're understanding absolutely nothing he teaches them. Mark's Jesus is very hostile to his followers, particularly Peter. Poor Peter comes off really badly in this story. So he's realised that what he thought he needed to do, choose followers and build a church or whatever, do what John the Baptist and predecessors have done, that's not working. He's also got sick of miracles and teaching large crowds of people because he's realised he's like some vaudeville magician that, thousands flock there, they hear about the wonderful things he does, then they just go away and he's forgotten. It's a complete waste of time. So before the walking on water scene, he spent a whole day, very reluctantly, you can pick this out of the text, teaching 5,000 whom he then feeds in the evening, sends them away. He sends his followers over the Sea of Galilee ahead of him. He goes up the mountain. Middle of the night, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, we're not told. He looks down and he sees they're starting to get rather frightened. There's a bit of wind, there's a bit of agitation in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. This is all a bit surprising. They're fishermen who spend their lives on the Sea of Galilee, so what are they worried about? There's no suggestion here that their boat's going to sink or that there's a terrible storm. Anyway, Jesus comes charging down the mountain and he crosses the water towards them. He sees them, he's approaching them, he sees them, and he's so fed up with what he sees, he's about to go off in another direction. He just doesn't want anything to do with them. They don't recognise him. They think he's a ghost, a phantasm in Greek. Literally, he's a phantasm. So there's this sort of monstrous figure approaching across the water in the middle of the night. You have to remember there are 2,000 demons under the surface of the water because he's just purged the pig that's legion of pigs. And they've all charged down the mountain a couple of episodes earlier. So they're drowned in the water. So you've got the sense of these demonic forces which he has a particularly intimate relationship with, or under his feet, which, you know, in the sort of Shakespearean Midsummer Night's Dream sort of spectral world that this is that Mark's conjuring up. The sense of all these demons under the water helps imagine that it's uninteresting to speculate on what form he's in. Was he an apparition? What is he? It's just misreading the story to even worry about that. I don't have time to go into this here, but the episode immediately before the walking on water is the beheading of John the Baptist. And they're also, the two go together in Mark. You can see very strong connections between the two. And in that is, of course, the dancing girl before the drunken elders. And I think there's some suggestion Jesus even dances across the water and then seen as this monstrous ghost who, by this stage in the story, Jesus is terrifying his followers. It's been wonderful. They've been in his presence. People are coming from all over Palestine to hear him, and weeks of trekking or donkey riding, crowds of 5,000. I mean, the only occasions in which in that period you would have seen a crowd of that size was armies going past to war. I mean, he has this extraordinary reputation. So you can imagine the followers were thinking, we're close to him, how wonderful this is. But the better they know him, the more terrifying he becomes. And then we have this pivotal scene in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. The wind is rising. Now John picks this up. I think John sometimes has an uncanny insight into what Mark's doing and expands it. He calls it a sort of a gale of pneuma, spirit, the sort of Holy Spirit. In Greek the word is pneuma, which means breath, wind or spirit. The Greek is much richer than the English word spirit. But there's a sense also of this sort of holy breath or wind coming down across at 4 o'clock in the morning. So you've got the poor old followers terrified out of their wits. Jesus comes up to the boat, and in Greek he says 5 words. Courage, I am. He doesn't say it is me, or what most of the translations you've got in English will say. He just says, I am. Don't fear. The don't fear is, I think, directed to the followers. And it's a Freudian negation. It's basically saying don't fear to them will have the opposite effect. It will terrify them, put the fear of the living God into them. And there's not much God in Mark, by the way, especially in that second half of the story. And it does. It has exactly. He's realised normal teaching methods don't work with his followers. So I think it's a tactical decision. I'm going to try and terrify them and see if that makes them understand it. It doesn't work either, of course. The courage, I suspect, is to himself, because he's so dispirited, but he's completely alone. His followers are useless. The crowds are just tiresome. He really doesn't know what he's doing by this stage. His courage is almost to himself. And then in the middle we've got this I am, which becomes his central teaching. In effect, I think what he's saying here is the capital T truth you need to understand is I am. And this becomes pivotal then to the whole of the Mark narrative. And of course, anyone would respond, we all would respond to that, well, what in the hell does he mean by I am? It's obviously about being, about the I and its nature. Well, the first half of the story, he sort of gives a whole series of examples of what the I am is not. It's not family. He's very cruel to his own family. I have no mother, I have no best. He says, I have no family. It's not where you come from. It's not Nazareth. If you're asking the question, what's important in who I am, the sort of key identity question, it's not if this is Mark's Jesus. It's not family. It's not where you come from. It's not your trade, carpenter's son or whatever. Toughest of all in Mark, it's not whether you're a good person or not. It's not ethical. Mark's Jesus is not really interested in morals. I mean, there's a bit of teaching of morals, but very, 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 very little. It's not whether or not you're a good person. So what is it? And I would suggest the second half of the story then takes up. And you only learn that by immersing yourself in the story, and to some degree you end up identifying with Jesus. You identify with all sorts of characters in the story, but also partly with Jesus as you go through this quite harrowing series of episodes leading up to the crucifixion. And you probably all know this, there's no resurrection in Mark. This is not a resurrection story. It's much more like a Greek tragedy written in Greek. It really ends with a crucifixion and then an empty tomb. It ends in tragedy. The empty tomb has the hopeful component. There's a young man in white inside the tomb, and he tells three terrified, everyone's afraid in Mark, three terrified young women, don't be alarmed. And it's really like he's addressing us from outside, from inside the tomb. He's addressing the reader, don't be alarmed. That, actually as in classical Greek tragedy, somehow everything's all right, although we've just witnessed about as horrendous a death as you can possibly imagine. And it ends with a terrible death scream. Jesus' last utterance in Mark is a terrible death scream. In his tracing, and I'm not going to produce doctrine here interpreting Mark's Jesus is saying 1, 2, 3, 4 about what is the nature of who I am. That doesn't work that way. It only works by you reading the story. And my experience, this story works best in a reading group collectively, not one-to-one with an individual. That's how I got to know the story. Should we open this for discussion, or shall I keep going a little bit longer? A bit longer. You know, going to sleep? Yep. Right. Another, and I can go on endlessly about this. I'm not a practicing Christian, by the way, I never have been, but this story did something to me. The cursing of the fig tree. There's this but it's only in Mark, it's not in any of the other Gospels. It's the first day of the Monday of the last week in Jerusalem before the crucifixion. They're staying in Bethany, a village close by. Early morning on the Monday, they're walking to climb the hill up to Jerusalem. And Jesus is angry. He's not a composed Jesus at all. I mean, he's not magisterial like John's Jesus. He's angry at this point, and his anger gets displaced into hunger. He suddenly feels hungry, and he sees a fig tree. And the fig won't produce figs. Because he wants figs, the fig won't. The poor old fig tree, it's not the season for producing figs. So he curses the fig tree. And the poor old tree's completely innocent. Curse. The followers look at this. They go up the hill. He wanders around. He actually turfs everyone out of the temple. He does the cleansing up there. Tuesday morning, they're walking up the hill again, and they pass the fig tree, and Peter observes, Master, and they always call Jesus Master in Mark. He's a teacher. Is Jesus the teacher? Master. Look, that tree is withered from its roots upwards, and Jesus says yes, and he links it with if you have trust, or if you have faith, you can pick mountains up and throw them into the sea. The reference there, maybe the most obvious reference, is to the temple, which is at the top of this particular mountain. He's about to throw the culture of the Jews into the sea. This is not an ecumenical text. The fig itself, which is really a sort of, to use Australian vernacular, a sort of black stump, has now appeared in 24 hours. We've just got this black stump. The most obvious association is with the followers and with Peter himself. Now, this, just to give you an idea of the complexity of Mark, Peter is the fall guy in this story. The first parable, the most important parable by far in Mark, is the parable of the sower, which is, you all know, that seed sown in different sorts of territory. The parable's fairly easy to understand, but the followers, the disciples, don't get it. And so Jesus does an exegesis. It's actually not very interesting exegesis. The one thing it does suggest to us is that he's most interested in seeds sown on stony ground. And some of you may recall, seeds sown on stony ground rises up with enthusiasm at the start, but the moment the sun comes out and gets hot, it withers because it hasn't got any roots. Now, stony ground in Greek is Petrodes. Jesus has given the nickname Peter to Simon Peter. Peter in Greek, of course, is Petros. Petros Petrodes. Stony ground is the material out of which Peter is fashioned. That's his being, actually. And it's true, he flares up with enthusiasm initially when he meets Jesus, becomes a follower, then he withers. In this story, he withers. We've got the fig tree at the end with the withered roots. This is Peter. The first reading of the fig tree, this is Peter and the other followers. There are a whole series of other associations with withering. We've got the man with the withered hand, the healing of the man with the withered hand, who interestingly enough is to heal him, Jesus takes him out of the church, out of the synagogue, out of the temple. Now the suggestion there, and I'm condensing a lot here, is you have to be taken outside churches in order to be healed. Peter's impulse, Peter is the sort of caricature church person in this particular story. Peter's impulse is when he's angry to build churches. Now, before you... In the Transfiguration, they go up the mountain, and just to reinforce this. And there's a black, Jesus is up shining in bright, brilliant white, in the sort of his baptism of fire. Peter and the other two can't look on him because it's too bright. There's a black cloud overhead. Peter says, let's put up tents for the three holy men. Let's put up tabernacles. This is the Greek word, also means tents. Now it's like he reads the black cloud, out of which the voice of God comes, as rain. It's a profane reading. So we need to put up tents to keep the holy men dry. Now water is Peter's, this is right through the text we get these associations of withering and of water with Peter. Unlike fire and pneuma or Holy Spirit with what Jesus is gesturing towards. So the fig tree in that scene is partly Peter. It's also partly, I think, the cross. This is the vertical post on which Jesus is going to be nailed in 3 days. In 3 days' time, and there's an either/or then for this fig. The fig tree becomes very heavily charged. There's an either/or. Is it just a profane black stump, a dead is dead, black stump, or is it the enabling vertical? That it takes us out into the horizontal, the plane of the corpse, into the vertical, which allows an upward connection. So it's partly a reference to Jesus too in this fig. There's also in this particular scene there's a contrast between two types of time. Greek has two, it's chronos and kairos. Chronos is a normal chronological time, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, normal time. But there's another sort of time, kairos time or epic time. You know, we all know this. There are moments in life in which 5 seconds can be utterly transformative. From a stroke to falling in love to... There are those special times in life when time's quite different, the kairos times. Now this is Jesus with the fig is basically saying this fig is lost in chronos time. It cannot produce fruit when at the key moment, which is understandable, it's just a poor old fig tree. But it isn't able to make the transition into kairos. Now that's true with his followers and particularly Peter too. And it's a very, very high demand. Very, very high demand on his followers and also on himself. We end with the empty tomb and no resurrection. I think the other the Mark, Matthew, Luke, we can talk about this if you want, that Jesus narrative, which is just as important as the one I'm telling, that leads into resurrection. So it sort of ends as a resurrection story. And if you want to get literal, as with Catholic theology, if you behave morally in this life, you're a good person, you go to confession, you're a virtuous person. If you're an ethical person, then you will be rewarded religiously. You will go to heaven when you die. So the Catholic Church, it's theologically quite brilliant, gives a metaphysical religious reward for an ethical life. Now Mark basically poo-poos all of that. Capital T truth is not of that order whatsoever. This is a very, very different Jesus. In fact, so what do you do with two figures that are so different in terms of their central truths and their central teachings as these two Jesuses? Well, I suppose one of the great richnesses of the Christian tradition is it's had this extraordinary plurality to work with. Mark ends with this empty tomb and the young man in white, who is probably I don't know if you remember the Gethsemane scene, the terrible forsakenness. It's a bitterly sad, bleak scene in Mark where Jesus collapses to the ground. His three followers keep going to sleep. He's led by Peter. He tells them to wake up. They go back to sleep, wake up, they go back to sleep. They've got no idea. They've got no sense of the moment whatsoever. And Jesus at the end, he's really tough with Peter and James and John. He says basically, don't bother waking up. Endless sleep is your condition. There's no point in talking to you. And with the cock crow, Peter weeps, and we don't see Peter again in the narrative, and the whole implication is that Peter is doomed. There's no restoration. And of course, then Matthew inverts the story completely, and John's more generous to Peter too. But the young man in white in the empty tomb is a very strange figure. Some of the theologians that said he's an angel, and Rudolf Bultmann, even sort of theologians, that's completely implausible. When if it was an angel, Mark would have said so much, very precise. Matthew turns into two angels. The figure at the empty tomb. In Gethsemane, there was a young man on the margins of the scene, not one of the followers, who's been following along, watching, and suddenly the arresting party sees him. He flees and he sheds his white robe, and he goes off through the dark olive grove naked. This is sort of part of this is a baptism image. He sheds the past life, and it's very likely, I think, can't prove it, but he's the figure who then reappears at the empty tomb. He has shed this is a kairos transformation that's gone on in the young man in white. By the way, in Mark, most of the figures who respond to Jesus, who come across him and respond to him are women. The young man in white's an exception, but most of the figures who get it in Mark's story are women. And the male followers are all unteachable, basically. So, you made what you wanted. It's pretty obvious. I suppose my ultimate point here in talking about Jesus today is that this is one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, Heidegger. His philosophy is all about the nature of being. As a philosopher, it's very abstract. You can't get much from Heidegger. I like Heidegger's philosophy. You can only get real concrete, real flesh out of stories, not out of abstract philosophy. Mark and John provide this. Now this, at the heart of our culture, coming out of the great Christian traditions, is a treasure trove of teachings and a teacher. A saviour in a modern secular sense, who's an extremely enigmatic figure. And this whole text is enigmatic, which sort of suits our times. It also suits, we sort of, Almost everything important in life we have to do by flying by the seat of our pants today, from funerals to, whatever it is, we sort of blindly try and find our way without quite knowing what we're doing. Now, this is exactly the sort of figure that Marx Jesus is. We're not sure about most of the important ethical questions anymore. I mean, there's not much that's black and white. There's a huge amount that's grey. This also fits with the sort of enigmatic teacher that this Marx Jesus is. So I think it's just terrible that the great text for our times really on who we are is the Jesus story. It's the Jesus story, but it's marginal in where it's being told. I think I should stop and we should have some discussion because the story does pop up in popular culture, in strange guises in films like Fight Club or in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. There are projections of a saviour figure in all sorts of very important. Waiting for Godot, probably the most influential play of the 20th century. The tramps are waiting for Godot. Who's going to save them? I mean, he's probably a figment of their imaginations, but that shows you the need for a saviour in our culture. There's a sort of saviour syndrome in our culture where Jesus may be fading from the imaginations and from knowledge, but the need for what he represents in that archetype doesn't dim at all.